hope you're comfortable. There you go. Yeah, they're very lightweight. Don't push it off the side. Historian down. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Eliza Canty-Jones, and I serve here at OHS as the editor of our journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, and as our public outreach manager. And I am so pleased to be able to host tonight's program and to hear what I know will be a really fascinating discussion. I want to first take a quick minute and offer thanks to the University of Washington Press. They have done ongoing work in publishing significant titles that really help move forward our understanding of the past in truly meaningful ways. The press has a lot of series, including, they pay particular attention to environmental history through the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Series that is edited by William Cronin. The Republic of Nature, Mark Fiege's book, was published as part of that series, as was Marsha Weisiger's Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country. And I'm excited here at OHS on August 14th, we'll host another of those series authors, Mark Harvey, to discuss his new book, Wilderness Forever, Howard Zahniser and the Path to the Wilderness Act. And we also expect to bring you at least one more author from that series before the end of 2014, so stay tuned. We at OHS are truly grateful for all of the work that people continue to do to maintain robust scholarly publications. The Oregon Historical Society, as many of you know, was founded in 1898. At our core are the massive collections held by our research library. It is one of the most important repositories of its kind on the West Coast. We also serve the public through museum exhibits on 3 floors in this building, educational programs including school group tours and traveling trunks that go out around the state, and authoritative online resources, including the Oregon History Project and the Oregon Encyclopedia. And since 1900, OHS has continuously published the Oregon Historical Quarterly. It's in its 115th volume year right now. Many of you are members, and so you get the journal. It has always been a benefit of membership with OHS. And it's both a valuable scholarly publication, and it's a source for history that's enjoyed by general readers as well. We here at the Oregon Historical Society are committed to the ongoing conversation among scholars and members of the public. And that's a conversation that demands preservation of historical materials, public access to those materials, and a variety of formats that allow for discussion about how we understand the past and why that understanding matters today. Tonight's program, quite obviously, is one way of fostering that discussion. In his introduction to the book, Mark Fiege writes that he wants to open a conversation. He says, "My hope is that those who find my method intriguing or compelling will apply it to subjects I left out." We've asked him to describe his method, so I won't get into that right now, but it's an incredibly intriguing one to apply to the history of our state. I would not say that historians of Oregon have ignored nature, of course. It sits at the center of some of the most significant events in our history, including, for example, disease epidemics that nearly destroyed, but did not, native peoples, and the vast reconstruction of rivers that took place during the 20th century. But nevertheless, Dr. Fiege's book asks us to focus on stone, soil, sweat, and other forms of nature that make historical accounts seem strange. We are incredibly fortunate to have living and working here in Oregon a group of distinguished scholars who can take on that challenge, suggesting ways that considerations of nature will allow us to see familiar events in Oregon's history in strange new ways. So I'm going to introduce all 4 of the speakers, and then they're going to take their turns and then discuss probably a little bit among themselves, and then we'll open up the conversation to all of you. To my left is Mark Fiege. He is a native of Washington State, a graduate of Western Washington University, Washington State University, and the University of Utah, where he received his doctorate in 1994. He is the author of Irrigated Eden, The Making of an Agricultural Landscape in the American West, which was also published by the University of Washington Press. It received the Idaho Library Association's Best Book Award and the Forest History Society's Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Award. He has taught history at Colorado State University since 1994, is affiliated with that university's Public Lands History Center, and is a faculty advisor to the Agricultural, Natural Resources, and Water Resources Archives at the university's Morgan Library. William Lang, on the other side, is a professor emeritus at history at Portland State University, where he taught environmental and public history. From 1977 until 1989, he was editor of Montana, the magazine of Western history. He has written or edited 7 books on Pacific Northwest history, including Confederacy of Ambition, William Winlock Miller and the Making of Washington Territory, Great River of the West, Essays on the Columbia River, and 2 Centuries of Lewis and Clark, Reflections on the Voyage of Discovery. From 1990 to 2003, he directed the Center for Columbia River History, and he currently serves on the Oregon Historical Society's Board of Directors. Larry Lipin, to his right, is professor of the Department of History at Pacific University, where he also serves as the chair of Environmental Studies, Policy, Culture, and Society. He earned his PhD at UCLA and has published 2 books, most recently, Workers in the Wild, Conservation, Consumerism, and Labor in Oregon, 1910 to 1930. He's currently researching journalist Eleanor F. Baldwin, and I'll tell you what he says about her, that she constantly reinterpreted the Reformed tradition that she understood as her familial inheritance over a period that ranges from Reconstruction to the eve of the Great Depression. And Dr. Lipin also serves on the editorial advisory board for the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And finally, Marsha Weisiger is the Julie and Rocky Dixon Chair of U.S. Western History and an Associate Professor of History and Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon. She is the author of Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country and also Land of Plenty, Oklahomans in the Cotton Fields of Arizona, 1933 to 1942. She is currently working on 3 book projects. The River Runs Wild, which ponders the meanings of wildness through an exploration of Western rivers. Danger River, which examines how men and women narrated their adventures down the Green and Colorado rivers. And a collection of essays on environmentalism and counterculture, tentatively titled Simplify, Simplify. So please join me in welcoming these 4 scholars.
So can everybody hear us? Do we need? We have microphones lying here. Do we need a microphone? Are we okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. So I guess I'll start off, and I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Republic of Nature, this book that I wrote. And I'll explain some aspects of that I think will open up and kind of do a handoff to my friends and colleagues up here for them to talk about particular things that they're thinking. But I wrote the Republic of Nature in an attempt to reimagine how we understand American history. I wanted to try something different. What I wanted to do was to take the perspectives of environmental history and apply those less to topics that you would predict or could think of as being typically environmental history and apply them to unexpected topics. My argument is that even the core topics of American history, the kinds of things you probably have heard of, undoubtedly, but don't think of as being environmental history, in fact have environmental histories to them. Witchcraft, the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the American Republic, the expansion of cotton culture and slavery across the American South, the life of Abraham Lincoln. So there's not a chapter on Henry David Thoreau, but there's a chapter on Abraham Lincoln as a man of nature. There's a chapter on the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War, a chapter on the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. There's a chapter on the making of the atomic bomb. There's a chapter on the Supreme Court case, the famous civil rights case, Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. There's a chapter on the 1973-1974 oil shock, the famous gas lines. So I thought, wow, what if we took environmental history and applied it to topics that we usually don't think of as being environmental history? Now, environmental history, of course, there's some easy definitions if this is a new term to you. One standard definition is that it's the role and place of nature in human life through time. Environmental history is the study of the role and place of nature in human life through time. Another slightly longer, nonetheless brief definition is that environmental history looks at past human actions that have shaped the environment and then the consequences of that reshaped and changing environment for human society. So there is this sense that people are changing the material, physical environment around them, And that changing environment then has consequences for the kinds of things that people can do. I think one way to think about this is in light of contemporary environmental circumstances and events and their consequences for society. The one example I often raise with my students is Hurricane Katrina, and how there was the Bush administration, fresh off of its victory, Bush announcing his political agenda, and then Hurricane Katrina hits, and that hurricane brought the Bush administration to its knees. I don't think that was the only source of political problems that the Bush administration ran into, of course, but I think Katrina and the consequences of that, the storm of criticism delivered to the Bush administration, played a powerful role in weakening it. You think about Obama's administration and the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Now, that didn't do the kind of damage to the Obama administration that Katrina did to Bush, but it did do some damage. So right there is a clear example of how environmental circumstances, what people do to the environment, consequences of that affect politics. And just think of all the other things going on today. Energy, fracking, disease, species extinctions, droughts, if you're from California, on and on and on. There are a range of things going on in our world today, and we can see right in front of us the consequences for our societies and for our political orders and things like that. So that was the general idea. This is not really entirely a new approach to doing history. One scholar and book that environmental historians point to as being foundational to our practice is George Perkins Marsh, 1864 book, Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. George Perkins Marsh, 1864. This was a sweeping survey of human civilization from the perspective of what today we call environmental history. A book I have been reading of late, and which environmental historians are revisiting quite intensively right now, is a book by the ecologist Fairfield Osborn, Our Plundered Planet, 1948. 1948, Fairfield Osborn, Our Plundered Planet, which was another sweeping survey about human actions on the environment and then the problems that arise from that and how that limits human society. So this is hardly a new approach. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is that for a long time, environmental perspectives on human history were overlooked, marginalized, in some respects ignored. So I think this idea that human history unfolds from past people's interactions with their physical environment, it's not new, but for much of the 20th century, I think it was downplayed. It was overlooked, it was marginalized. And here's what I think happened. I think for much of 20th century, you had a bunch of university-based academic historians who lived relatively well-off, affluent lives. The United States, like other modernizing nations, was tapping into coal and oil, and these had profound effects on wealth, on people's ability to have clothing and food and warmth and libraries and archives and dry places to work. And so historians writing about the past, I think because of this, they could imagine, mostly they wrote about great men, presidents and generals and so forth, but they wrote even about what I think is the primary story, the great story of the modern world, which was the human struggle for freedom. They wrote about that as if it had very little, if anything, to do with physical circumstances, with environmental circumstances, with disease, with energy, with food production. It was as if, as Patty Limerick, the historian, once said, history took place about a foot off the ground. So I think that's what happened. But by the 1970s, conditions, environmental events in the United States and elsewhere around the world were making it increasingly hard for historians to ignore that reality. And you're probably familiar, I think most of you can remember back through the 70s, events with energy, events with toxics in the environment and pollution, concerns over wildlands and so forth. And so it was in the 1970s that this environmental perspective on the past came to the fore again. Historians reasserted it, and environmental history emerged as a named field. environmental history from the 1970s onward. So eventually, I mean, what environmental historians did was they first focused on those topics that are most obviously and in many ways predictably environment. They looked at things like national parks, they looked at agricultural and rural landscapes, they looked at forests and forestry, wildlife. One set of them worked on those kind of things, so they're all well and good. Those are foundational studies to environmental history. Another set of environmental historians began to look at things like DDT. They began to look at pollution and things like that. But eventually, environmental historians came around and said, what about everything? If the premise is that all life is embedded in the environment, what would other topics look like? And I think at that moment, environmental historians began to focus on, in an American history context, for example, the core events of the nation's past. Events of the sort that I just named that constitute chapters in my book that most people don't, right off the top, think have anything to do with the environment. So that was the opening for me. That's where I appeared. And I think there's a variety of reasons why I began to think this. As I explained in the book, I was teaching a class, and a couple of my students came up to me one day, and they said to me, you say this is American history. I was teaching American environmental history, and I was loving it. I was loving talking about conservation and John Muir and forests and parks and all this kind of cool stuff, you know, and it's great. And they said, you say this is American history? And I said, yes. And they said, well then, if this is American history, how come we're not studying? And the two topics they named were the American Revolution and the Civil War. And I tried to say, well, when you look at environment, it as a theme, a different narrative of American history emerges, and they would not have it. They wanted me to do the Revolution and the Civil War. Okay, so that was the beginning of this, and I began to think about it. Well, what would the Civil War look as environmental history? And then what I found is that other people since then have begun to study these kinds of things. Warfare. Many environmental historians now are looking at warfare. There's a growing group of American historians focusing on the Civil War and emancipation, slavery, the Civil War and emancipation, increasing attention devoted to the environmental history of those events. So there's one set that is going on. But in a variety of ways, in different fields, people are beginning to look at this. And I think it's really interesting how there's another set of these historians who are beginning to look at events in the western states. And this is where I think I can begin to set up Marsha and Larry and Bill. But for example, in my own state of Colorado, the historian Elliot West, he began to study what is probably the most pivotal event. It's certainly the most emotional event, the event that arouses the most emotion, and that's the Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. And Professor West, he'd been studying this event for a long time, and he finally began to come around to the environment. And what he concluded was that Sand Creek was the outgrowth, it was the consequence of a much longer-term competition between Indians and the United States for energy in the form of prairie grass. So those competition between the oncoming Euro-American settlers and the gold rush into Colorado and being accompanied by the Army, it put tremendous pressure on the forage for the horses. And the horses were powerful animals that liberated and revolutionized life for both native peoples as well as the oncoming Euro-Americans. And so there, he positioned this event, the Sand Creek Massacre, right, as a consequence of environmental conditions. So that's one example. Also in my state, a famous event is the Ludlow Massacre, 1914. The outcome of a coal strike by miners. And coal, there you go. I mean, they're liberating this coal everywhere, all up and down the Front Range. Where I live, my institution, Colorado State University, everything we've got, agriculture, our buildings, everything, it is a consequence of the extraction of coal in southern Colorado coal fields. You take out that coal, and what does Colorado look like? No offense to Nevada, I think it looks more like Nevada. You know? But we got all that good stuff. We got all that wealth, all that warmth, all that electricity because of that coal. And what the author of this book, Thomas Andrews, Killing for Coal, it's a fabulous book, does is to show that the Ludlow Massacre and the Great Colorado Coalfield War was the outcome of that environmental transformation, tapping into those coal reserves, and the violence that that extractive process entailed. Move north to Idaho. Really fascinating story. A story named Carl Brooks has written about a dam that was never built. The dam that the Truman administration envisioned for Hell's Canyon, and the Truman administration's dream that this was going to underpin the fair deal the way Grand Coulee underpinned the New Deal. So if you think about the extent to which Democratic Party power is literally built on the construction of dams and the generation of hydroelectric power, I can't think of a more striking example of how the manipulation of nature, the manipulation of the modern world, allows for a related political transformation. And then what's really cool in this story is the political consequences of the defeat of that dam. So there's 3 examples from the western states of mainstream events. They're military, they're labor, they're political, that have been reinterpreted because their authors focus on the environment. So that was my approach to the Republic of Nature. It was a really fun book to write. I actually believe that what I've written is mostly correct. So I think I got it pretty much right. But I think you can argue with it, you can debate it, there are other perspectives on it. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to my friends and colleagues.
I think I'm supposed to go first because my topic is the oldest of the 3. First of all, I want to thank the Oregon Historical Society and Eliza for putting this together. It's great to have Mark here and to have him give you his explanation of writing this terrific book. And I really highly recommend that you read it. And you'll find that you'll read it again and again. It's got a lot of stuff in it. What I'm going to do is take an incident that almost every school kid in the Northwest knows about in Oregon, and I assume everybody here knows about. How many of you know what happened to the Whitmans in 1847? Well, for those of you who didn't put up your hand, I'll assume that you maybe do know, but just to remind you, they were murdered by Caillou's natives, November 29, 1847, at Wailatpu, which is the name for the mission ground near Walla Walla. To back up and ask some questions about this, we need a little bit of a prologue. All historians need prologues. And that is that from the very moment that it took place, almost, it was called a massacre. A heavy word. And secondly, that the response from the Oregon Provisional Government, we were not yet a territory, and from the Hudson's Bay Company was swift and aggressive. And they harassed the Cayuse people, especially their main chiefs, who had long had relationships with the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company had been in the Walla Walla area or its predecessors since 1813, almost 20 years of existence before the next individual comes who establishes a place there, Marcus Whitman. And so they harassed, after the murders, harassed the Cayuse sufficiently for months until in early 1850, Cayuse chiefs decided that the best way out of this problem, and it was a problem because they were being threatened essentially with wholesale destruction, was to give over potential murderers, which they do in the Dalles, the so-called Cayuse Five. These individuals, by the way, we don't know whether any of them actually took part in this murder, but nonetheless sent to Oregon City, and there in a matter of days, although they did have a defense lawyer, they were found guilty by a jury and hanged on June 3rd, 1850, in a public spectacle in which women and children outnumbered men in the audience. A curious fact. Now, we don't want to dwell on that, because my point is not to take this story and go through all the details of it. You can do that elsewhere. But to recognize a very kind of fundamental message that is disseminated in classrooms throughout the Northwest. And that is that this was a clash of cultures. This was a event that is emblematic of the relative impossibility of communication and interchange between American resettlers and native people. And further, that it was an act of cruelty and an outrage. And that the Caillou's people, throughout the 20th century, were labeled as the perpetrators of this deed. Now, this cultural clash, which was put into practically the script of the Northwest in 1936, when the National Park Service consecrated as a National Historic Site the Whitman Massacre, as they called it, ground. It's the only mission that has that designation in the Northwest. That National Park Service interpretation reinforced the same idea. So my question, taking off from Mark Fiege's suggestion, is to ask this. Is that really how we should understand it? Or is there another way to look at this very familiar and fundamentally cultural, if not political, story? And we should ask, I think, three questions. One, how did this event take place, and what did nature have to do with it? Two, what was, in essence, the dispute about among native people and the non-native resettlers? And three, what was the consequence, long-term consequence of this event, all from the standpoint of what does nature have to do with it? In 1836, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman went to the fur trade rendezvous on their way west as missionaries for the American Board of Commission of Foreign Missions to establish a mission in the Nez Perce country of Oregon and Washington, which was not known as Oregon and Washington at the time, it was Oregon country. And they arrive in 1836 at Fort Vancouver, and John McLaughlin tells them that to establish a mission in the Caillou's homeland was probably not a very good idea because, number one, it would be difficult to supply you. Number two, you would be forced on your own deserts and have to take care of yourselves. And number three, it was really dangerous. But Marcus Whitman was hard-headed. He was stubborn, and he went anyway. He with Narcissa, who was pregnant at the time, to establish this mission. And they did with an open invitation from the Caillou's, who had pleaded with others to bring the book and to bring the power of Christianity, which they recognized was evidently exceedingly powerful within their culture so that they could take advantage of whatever this power might be and to establish a mission. And they chose a place, Wailatpu, which in Sahaptin meant place of the ryegrass, a beautiful area near a creek that flowed into the Walla Walla. And if you go there today, you can see that where the Park Service has its landscape, and you can see how beautiful it is. And they invited them there to do basically one thing, which was to impart to the people of the Cayuse the power that their religion and their faith offered. 2 years later, in 1838, Tipi, one of the 3 chiefs who owned the land upon which this landscape lay, came to Marcus Whitman with an objection. And the objection was based upon the fact that Whitman had not delivered any material goods or services to the Cayuse. And Tipi basically said, you have reneged on the agreement we had. You have not delivered any of this power, and you have not delivered any of the wealth from this land. And what he was talking about was 17 acres of cultivated land on the mission grounds, plus the mission buildings, which were substantial and quite clearly, you might say, a reflection of wealth, even though they certainly weren't wealthy by Whitman standards, having come from New York and really basically from a middle-class, mid-19th century family. But Tipi was focused on this to the extent that he recognized that 17 acres of potatoes, corn, hay, berries, row crops, and fruit trees produced wealth. And that wealth was retained by the Whitmans and disposed and essentially given to those who the Whitmans favored. And the Whitmans favored those who were more friendly to their approach to Christianity and community on the mission grounds. And to those who were not, for various reasons, they didn't get that benefit. In addition, Tipi was more critical because the mission house itself sat on the land that he planted. And so not only was the mission part of a bargain, but it was part of a very personal bargain with Tipi and his family. Now that doesn't mean that the native people, the Cayuse in particular, weren't engaged in agriculture at some of the missions, because they were. Wascopam at the Dalles is an example, where the Methodists had 20 acres under cultivation, but could never talk the Wasco people into actually working the land, because that was the big dream, was to bring Christianity to the native people and to have them adopt it and an agricultural settled way of life. The Cayuse, Sahaptins on the plateau, kind of dabbled with agriculture. They had some land they cultivated, not the 17 acres that Whitman controlled, but other land. Put potatoes in the ground. They put in root crops because root crops were what they had gathered as part of their traditional gathering, especially camas, which most of you, I think, probably know something about, and in the wetter areas, wapato. So potatoes make some difference, and everybody who's grown potatoes knows pretty much what happens. You put them in the ground, what happens? They grow. You don't have to do anything particular. And they would come back and basically dig up these potatoes as a product of the earth, just as they dug up wapato and camas. But they didn't put any time into it. And one of the reasons they didn't is that the Cayuse did not bargain for a change in their economy. They did not bargain for a different engagement with nature. Their engagement with nature was still the one that they'd had traditionally for thousands of years, which was gathering, hunting, and capture. And it was done, as most of you probably know, in different places, at different seasons, and with different equipment, and with different people involved in the labor. So what the Cailloux wanted to do was exactly what they had done when they first welcomed Whitman, which was to participate in new power, new energy. They didn't leave their traditional religious beliefs, for example, but they adopted pieces of Christianity that they hoped would give them power. In other words, they were part of a widening world of all things that could give them sustenance and power, and not part of a narrowing world. But Whitman was determined. And just to remind you about the Protestant creed, those of you who don't remember it or have rejected it or whatever, you can't be baptized until what? Protestants tell me.
You've been shaved.
You have to accept, don't you, the message within your heart, and it has to be obvious. And Whitman would not allow any of these Cailloux to participate in a full manner until they had demonstrated that. One of the reasons why Cailloux and others leaked off to the Catholics is because the Catholics said, we'll baptize you right now, we don't care what you think. So, not just Ontipi, but others came to Whitman and asked him about why he wouldn't share in this. And in Ontipi's case and in others, they basically warned him as early as 1838, then again in 1839, then again in 1840, 1841, 1842, 1845, and 1847. They warned him, if you don't change your ways, we will drive you off our land. Because you haven't paid for it by way of rent, and you haven't delivered what you promised. They were particularly upset that Whitman would not allow them to run their own horses and cattle, by the way. Cailloux, they saw the benefit of cattle. They weren't fools. But it was part of what they were able to do as stock raisers. Whitman wouldn't let them run their horses on the uncultivated land on the mission grounds. Why was that? Because Whitman basically said, you must choose. You must choose between that old life and this new settled life. Participating only partly in agriculture is not embracing it. Whitman was forcing, in a real way, forcing a choice between these two worlds. It was a binary in a world that the Cailloux did not understand as being binary at all. In 1841, Charles Wilkes, on the great American exploring expedition, his group comes all the way up to the plateau. McLaughlin had told him that that was worth his travel, and he comes up and he writes in his report, there's a great deal of tension at Wailatpu because the Cailloux are complaining to Whitman that Whitman won't give them any of the product of their own land. And Whitman has never paid for the privilege of being here. Make a long story short, the Whitmans began to treat others than the Cailloux as favored people. First is the HBC and some of their friends, some that were settled out HBC, and some of them were just travelers. Hudson's Bay Company, because they had a post, Fort Nez Perces, nearby. And so they would come to the mission grounds, and they would be feasted and housed and everything else, everything coming from the land, from the Caillou's land, now in the hands of these interlopers. And then the first of the overland migrants that come in 1840, and they too come. And eventually, as some of you probably know, from the Overland Trail migration, the Sager kids, the ones who were rescued, come to the mission and live there for some time. But it's Whitman himself who has to go back to plead for more money for the mission, who comes back in 1843 leading the largest of the overland trains to that point right to the mission, making the mission almost automatically one of the last oases on the Oregon Trail. And of course, thousands upon thousands upon thousands are going to come. And with that comes all manner of other disturbances to the landscape. And the most important disturbance that was clear to the Cailloux was that these were agriculturalists, and what they were witnessing was a change in the basic fundamental economics of nature. By 1846, even Whitman understood the problem, and he began to negotiate with the Methodists to purchase Wascopam Mission at the Dalles and basically get out of Dodge. But he held on to his same positions, and by November, this, what I would call an irrepressible conflict, erupted. And especially after several of the Cailloux chiefs brought their horses into the fields in the late summer and early fall and had the horses eating the silage of the corn crop in the cultivated fields, which sent Whitman into an absolute outrage. And their response to him, which was recorded by others at the mission, was simple and direct. It's the product of the land. The horses can eat it. It's almost salt in the wound. It's very close. And at that point, again, told them, you come through with your original agreement, or we'll push you off the land November 29th. They're killed. I've taken up too much time, so I'm going to skip to the end, the last question, which is, how did this affect the Cailloux? First, it affects the Cailloux because it puts a stain on them. But second, it, in a way, rushes the process that might have taken much longer. First, there's territorial status in 1848, within months, really. And secondly, there's the movement to do something about this question of land tenure and land use, because it's really about land use, which is fundamentally, isn't it, the relationship of human beings to nature. And it's not just a one-way street, as Mark suggested. It's both what you do to nature and then what nature does back to you. And in that process, the only way to really solve the problem in American jurisprudence was to get clear title to the land, and that meant treaties, and that meant forcing the native populations to cede over land. And in this case, it's 1855, and the treaty, which is one of the largest ever assembled, treaty discussions in Walla Walla, almost within sight of Wailaku. That's the most eerie thing about this. And they're asked to do this, that is, Nez Perce, Walla Walla, Palouse, Umatilla, and Cailloux, to give over the land. They end up giving over 6.5 million acres. For residents on pre-selected reservations, of which there are only two, existing Nez Perce and the existing Yakima, larger, but in those two locations, if you can put that in your mind on a map. Nothing where the Umatilla Reservation now sits. The Cailloux held out and said, no, we will not leave this. And we won't leave it for some very fundamental reasons. This is part of what young chief said in that council. You embraced all my country. Where was I to go? Was I to be a wanderer like a wolf? Without a home, without a house, I would be compelled to steal. Consequently, I would die. I will show you lands that I will give you. We will then take good care of each other. I think the land where my forefathers are buried should be mine. That is the place I am speaking for. We will talk about it. We shall then know, my brothers, that is what I have to show you. That is what I love, the place. We got our roots. We live upon. The salmon comes up the stream. That is all. And so, what he's talking about is the relationship of nature to spirit so intertwined that he can't pull them apart. And Whitman, who not only wouldn't allow them to be part of the cultivated landscape unless they were fully committed, but he wouldn't even allow them in certain rooms of his house, because that somehow was an invasion as well. In other words, drawing lines. Isaac Stevens and Joel Palmer tried to talk the Cayuse out of this, and eventually they gave up. And they gave in to young chief and gave in to the Umatilla with the reservation, which now, all of you probably know, is near Pendleton, Oregon. So I would say that on the long sweep, nature was part of the original bargain. Nature is part of the problem, and I would say a proximate cause to the killing. And it becomes part of the eventual, not compromise, not adjustment, but the eventual bargain, a new bargain. And in the treaty is a phrase of economic use connected to the environment that the fishing nations, they are nations by treaty, on the Columbia in the late 20th century bring up and place in the courts and win the ability to help manage the Columbia River and salmon and their futures. Now you might notice that in all of this I haven't mentioned, as Mark did, the other great environmental disturbance, which are pathogens. The disease that is another proximate cause, the measles epidemic, and the killing, and the notion that Whitman was killed as a failed shaman, another explanation. I would argue that it's far less about that than it is about land use. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to talk about some people who understood the product of the land differently, who didn't see it as the result of labor. I want to talk about some pretty key and basic premises in Enlightenment political economy, the labor theory of value. This is a notion that's developed. In fact, we first really see it articulated, a labor theory of property, in John Locke, who certainly, in fact, when he's ruminating about this, developing his thinking, is arguing that the Cayuse got it all wrong. That nature's responsible for a negligible portion of the product of the land, that the result, the product, is the result of the labor. And without labor, there is nothing. This is foundational stuff, really, in many regards. It remains a constant of economic analysis, of political economy, until the late 19th century. Those whom we might identify as liberal political economists will begin to shift away from this and begin to look at mass demand as a truer basis for understanding the value of commodities. But nonetheless, for many years, the labor theory of value posits a relationship between nature itself and the nature embedded in human bodies, the labor that we exert, as a source of value. And while conservatives and liberals alike will depart from it, radicals interested in further democratizing American society, retain that sense of a labor theory of value as a concrete measurement not only of the worth of goods, but also of the justice of their society. So why is this relevant for Orwell? It's relevant because it is at the heart of the motivations of the fellow whom we usually associate with the rise of the Oregon system of direct democracy, the establishment of the initiative, the referenda, and the recall. And by imposing this around the turn of the century, Oregonians imposed the people on the legislative process. They broke down the monopolies, the control of political parties and of corporate interests. And the way that they did this, or the reason that they did it, had a lot to do with measuring the value of the body's exertion. And this came because of a very consequential reading. William U. Wren, whom we associate with this drive for direct democracy, was born in the Midwest, the state of Wisconsin. But he would spend the rest of his life in the West. He lived in Colorado for a number of years, and it was when he was in Colorado that he picked up a book that would change his life. It was Henry George's Progress and Poverty. George was a radical political economist, probably easily the most widely read political economist of his day. Progress and Poverty made his reputation. And he would become significant in New York labor circles in the 1880s and thereafter, and he would influence a lot of people, like you read. The reason why he was popular was because he was asking a really important question that goes on a lot of people's minds, which was, in the midst of such a productive social system, like the industrial capitalist economy of the United States in the late 19th century, why was there so much misery? How can we understand the justice of that if labor is indeed the source of all value? So what George did, I have to say that the labor theory of value, in many regards, has these sort of interesting origins. I mean, in some ways, it starts really with John Locke, but Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations builds on the labor theory of value. And Smith is interesting because he establishes a pretty optimistic view of economics. For him, it's not just about freeing markets, but doing so, he argues, is going to create a society in which working people enjoy higher wages. In fact, he says that a well-governed economy, one that is on the rise, is going to be characterized by relatively low profits and relatively high wages. So there's something very optimistic about this, right? Because it's going to spread, capitalism is going to spread the benefits broadly across society. So in fact, it does, in Smith's hands, seem to augur a world of progress and improvement, all the kinds of things that we usually associate with Enlightenment optimism. Well, within a generation, political economy took a more negative, pessimistic turn. And that's, we usually associate that with Thomas Malthus, who begins to write about human reproduction and its consequences on nature's productivity. And basically what he argues is that human beings are going to reproduce, they are going to reproduce exponentially, and that the increases that human beings can get out of the land through their labor can only increase arithmetically. Now, this is before the mining of coal begins to transform economic life. Fossil fuels are a source of energy that allow for what we might call exponential economic productivity, growth and productivity. But nonetheless, he's making this argument. And what he means is that, there's going to be more and more workers. And that means there's going to be fewer, lower and lower wages. And those workers are going to be competing for housing, too. And that means rents are going to go high. So essentially, because of workers' inability to actually control their numbers, their lot is pretty much going to be miserable. So a lot of people in the 19th century, people who had some qualms about the development of capitalism, had some real concerns about this, and Henry George was one of them. And Henry George, in his writings, is trying to restore the optimism of Smith. And there's a religious component to this. I mean, for George, to talk about natural law is to talk about the universe as God created it, working according to certain kinds of basic formula, which human reason can uncover. To say that God's intention would be that the mass of humanity would be impoverished and miserable would be, in George's words, blasphemous. So George sought the cause of poverty. He knew it could not be inherent in the system. And so what he found it to lay in the private ownership of land. And he pointed out it was private ownership of land that kept productive processes sort of mired in the muck. Speculators kept land out of production, and consequently creating higher unemployment, lower wages. And this affected not only working people who suffered lower wages, it affected manufacturers as well, who had to pay higher rents, and cutting into their profits and their ability to pay higher wages to their employees. So Henry George has a solution for this. It's a land value tax. A land value tax high enough that it would make it nonsensical to hold on to land and keep it unproductive. The goal of this land value tax, which comes to be known as the single tax, is to force land into productivity. And George is really an urban guy. Right? He understands, how this operates, how land monopoly certainly operates in the countryside. But he's really interested in the city and in forcing land at the core of cities to be rendered as productive as possible. So the only way you could hold on to land and pay the tax, the land value tax, you wouldn't be paying rent to a landlord, you'd be paying rent essentially to the state. And the only way you could do that would be to make that land productive. And that would increase employment, it would thereby increase wages, and it would get rid of those false perversions of natural law. So Henry George saw himself as uncovering the logic of natural law and that sense that a godly created world could not mean the necessary impoverishment of the masses of people who engage in productive labor. Because for George, the labor theory of value is where he begins. So Uren reads this and is totally motivated by this. He becomes a strong George follower. He eventually makes his way up to Oregon. He falls in with some other people who've read George, people in Clackamas County, and he eventually gets elected to the legislature. And there he engages in some political maneuvering that actually makes some of his populist supporters wince a little bit, but he is successful actually in getting, forcing the legislature to accept the initiative and referendum and recall. So direct democracy is the result of this. Now, why is this the result of that? Because he knew that no legislature would ever pass the single tax, because legislators could easily be bought off by railroad companies and timber companies and other significant landowners. So direct democracy, while it was a pretty general populist plan for UREN, it was a means to an end, and the end was a single tax. So beginning around 1910, UREN begins to work with the Oregon State Federation of Labor, and they run a series of initiatives to put one variant of the single tax or another on the ballot. And again, throughout this, the arguments from the labor movement are constantly about labor and the labor getting its proper reward, the need to put land into productive use. All of these themes are reiterated as if they had read Henry George, and of course many of them in fact had. But there's some other interesting things that happened during this period. This lasts from about 1910 through 1916. By 1918, they'd given up the single tax. Every one of these ballot measures goes down to pretty crushing defeat. But at the same time, they begin to take another tact. See, because it's interesting. If land needs to be productively engaged, then those who keep it from being productively engaged are a problem. And this might be true of speculators, but it also might be true of people who are interested in preserving nature. And the people who actually come into their sites are those who are interested in building scenic highways. And this is about the same time that the Columbia River Highway is being built. And they oppose the use of public funds for this. And they begin to work with the state branch. Both groups interested in opposing all bond measures that could possibly be used for scenic highways, because as they argue, you build a scenic highway, that means you can't cut down the trees, you can't productively use the landscape, you have to keep it as a primeval forest, because the goal is to preserve nature. And the goal, as they saw it, was to preserve nature, the inheritance of all human, of God's gift to all human beings. Now a gift merely to the rich, or those whom they now call auto enthusiasts. And so they tried to cut back on this kind of thing. Ultimately, of course, they did fail. Well, after World War I, things got a little bit more nuanced for a lot of these folks in the labor movement. For one, they dropped their objections to the income tax. They find that farmers won't work with them to pass a single tax measure, because of course it's going to put significant tax pressures on land. But farmers are interested in taxing incomes, many of them are. And they give up their sort of labor theory of value principles and agree to tax labor or income. And by the end of the 1920s, Oregon has a state income tax, and they have supported that. But there's some other interesting things happening about at the same time. The Oregon Labor Press begins to run articles, or little notes, essentially, about union members who have gone on weekend camping, hunting, or fishing trips. And their exploits begin to fill the pages of the Oregon Labor Press. And then there are stories about those workers and their families who went to places like Yellowstone or Mount Rainier. And so in other words, Henry Ford's innovations in assembly line production and the cheapening of the automobile are having an impact. Now, they're not using it to commute to work. They're using the automobile for weekend excursions. Right? And that means they're using the automobile to get out into some form of nature and some form of engagement with nature. And there's a very interesting, it's interesting to watch the processing that goes on in the labor press and also in their conventions. So for example, in 1920, there's an Oregon State Federation of Labor meeting in Bend. And they always try to do. They're interested in doing something, the Chamber of Commerce there suggests that they take a drive on one of the recently built roads through the lakes of the Cascades, of the eastern escarpment of the Cascades. And they wrote that down because what they're really interested in doing is seeing this irrigation project, which promises, of course, to put land in Central Oregon to more productive use. 3 years later, the American Federation of Labor holds its national convention in Portland. And the local arrangements committee is dominated by Portland trade unionists. And so that they write to the delegates across the nation that they should bring their wives to this meeting and to make a vacation out of it, because they put on the agenda a trip on the Columbia River Highway. And so by 1923, it's quite clear that the Oregon trade union movement has become auto enthusiasts themselves. They're doing exactly what the Chamber of Commerce would have done, about writing about the glories and splendor of Oregon's nature.
Okay, now for something completely different, I guess, in that I was asked to talk about the counterculture, which I've just started doing my research on, and its relationship to environmentalism. And I guess I would say that I see two ideas about the intersections between the counterculture and environmentalism. One is that the counterculture is really about, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that's really it. And the other is that environmentalism was really a hippie movement. And I think it's kind of in between that. And I'd say that I think that in both ways, the environmental movement that emerges out of Earth Day, the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, was in one sense fundamentally a countercultural movement, and I'm going to really talk about that a lot. I also think that the countercultural movement was in one sense fundamentally an environmental movement, so I do see these as really intertwined, beginning perhaps with Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, and with the many communes that exist throughout Oregon for lots of different reasons, for spiritual reasons, for there are lesbian separatist communes, there are anti-war communes, all kinds of different religious communes of various sorts that really make Oregon at the center of the countercultural movement in the first place. But I would say that in many ways, the countercultural movement is really what makes Oregon at the heart of the environmental movement in America. And I'm going to give just two examples. I want to be pretty brief because I want everybody to have a chance to talk with us today. But I want to talk about one organization that was here in Portland, Terra Squirma, and another organization, which is the one I'm really doing research on in Eugene, which was called the Hodad's Reforestation Cooperative. Environmental historians have just begun to look at the counterculture and its role in the environmental movement, which I find to be really interesting given that a huge amount of the scholarship in environmental history has always been about the environmental movements, beginning with the conservation movement of Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, the preservation movement of John Muir, the kind of ecological movements of Aldo Leopold and even Rachel Carson, that it's taken so long to get to counterculturalism and start to think about that. But one historian named Andrew Kirk has written an interesting book in which he argues that The countercultural environmental movement was fundamentally about technology and a debate about technology and what we now today call appropriate technology. But I would argue strongly that the countercultural movement and environmentalism was really about a critique of capitalism. So I think it's really interesting to hear, as sort of as a segue from thinking about the labor theory of value, because much of this was about creating an entirely alternative society, and that alternative society was based in various kinds of thinking of ways to not only have better stewardship of the earth, but to really fundamentally change our relationship with nature. And so, first of all, the two groups I mentioned. One is Terra Squirma. It founded, how many people have heard of Terra Squirma here in Portland? Really, I expected everybody to know about Terra Squirma. Well, they were an organization that did lots of different things in Portland, but one of the things that they founded was something called the, let's see, I'm going to have to make sure I get the total name of the organization right, the Sunflower Recycling Collective, the Sunflower Recycling Collective. And essentially that organization, as far as we can tell, created the first modern recycling program in the United States here in Portland. And they started off as a communal housing co-op, basically, and we're doing lots of things that had to do with the anti-war movement, with the civil rights movement, but they felt like they wanted to do something in which they basically take themselves off the grid, and one of the things is also then to recycle as part of this. And it begins actually at PSU, the very first recycling program in 1972, and somebody there begins recycling some stuff, and these guys, or these men and women with the Sunflower Recycling Collective, decide for something, what's at the time considered a crazy idea of curbside recycling, that they will go through and voluntarily go and pick up people's recycling and take that in. And eventually they develop the kind of system in which we all participate in paying for people to come to our curb and recycle. So I just find that to be, not only do we have the first bottle bill in the United States, but that we have the first actual curbside recycling program in the United States. But the group that I find the most interesting is this group called the HODADS. It's the HODADS Reforestation Cooperative, and they are a tree planting organization that it's begun in 1972 by a guy named Jerry Rust, who later becomes a county commissioner in Lane County, and two other of his friends. They happen to be unemployed, and they get, first of all, a job under contract with Weyerhaeuser to, well, it's not under contract, they get a job as employees at Weyerhaeuser to replant trees. It's very hard work. They're not paid very much per hour for doing this, and they think, why should we be working for the man? We're going to do this ourselves and go and get our own contracts with the Forest Service. And they begin doing this eventually, and they last from 1972 until the early 1990s. They get contracts with the U.S. Forest Service, oftentimes employing as many as 300 people in a season, and making $2 million a year in planting trees. And they do this all throughout not only the Pacific Northwest, but the Southwest too. They begin here in Oregon. They do some of this work in Idaho and Washington. They go down to Colorado, New Mexico. I guess those are the main places that I can think of off the top of my head. That they go and take these contracts to reforest places that have been clear-cut. And the interesting thing I find about them is that, well, there's a number of interesting things. One is they form the various crews that are mix of men and women. Most of the crews have some women on them. There are some, there's one lesbian separatist crew that's called, I'm going to have to look at my note again, I forget their name, it's pretty interesting. Full Moon Rising is the women's, the lesbian women's crew. They also have some crews that are mostly women, but they'll hire, the women will hire a couple men because it helps them to work faster, because the men are actually physically able to work faster. Because you're given a certain amount of land that you've got to reforest, a certain deadline for doing that. The trees have to be every so many inches, and they have to be planted in a certain way. And I went to, when I first arrived in Eugene, I've been here 3 years, and I had already planned to do this project, and I opened up the Eugene Weekly one day and saw, wow, the Hodads are having a reunion this weekend. I think I'm going to go to this, and they're doing a reception at this bookstore, and so if nothing else, I can act like I'm just going to go buy a book, and then I'll just crash their party. And which is what I do. I go crash their party. I tell them I'm really interested in studying the Hodads and interviewing people, and they invite me to their potluck that weekend so that I can contact all of these people. And they tell me about all of these, the various crews that they have and all of this sort of thing. And one of the things they do is as they replant these trees, they do this little dance. And I can't remember, they call it, have a name for it, I can't remember what it is, but it's like the Hodad dance, where you have this kind of, this hoe-like tool that's the Hodad, and you stick it in like a step, turn, plant, stomp with your foot and move, and you just kind of go from side to side, and if you're really talented, you can do this. And the thing is that these are on steep slopes that a lot of this planting is done, so it is really very hard labor, and so at any rate, that they managed to do this for working at doing this really for 20 years, running all of these crews. Most of the people there's a whole lot of bookkeeping that's involved with this. Everybody gets paid equal amounts for labor done, regardless of how fast you are, because they felt like it's capitalism that says that we're supposed to be paid for the speed that we go at, and we really want to break that capitalist idea. So I wanted to read you, there's this newspaper that they put out well, I think it was just periodic. I can't say that it was not every month, and it was more often than quarterly. It was called Together. And one person, Hal Hartzell, wrote what I think of as a manifesto that he titled Drop Back In. And it kind of signifies, I think, the countercultural idea that's behind all of this. He says, "We have come a long way in our formulation of a new consciousness. We have gone through the violence of civil disobedience together. We have witnessed the subtle oppression of our people and the not so subtle oppression of our third world brothers. We have heard the words of Timothy Leary to turn on, tune in, and drop out. We have seen frustration with the nature of the existing governmental mentality, the moneyed classes, the corporate juggernaut imposing itself on our subliminal consciousness. We have the words of Jefferson calling out of our past for a revolution every 20 years to maintain a healthy organism. We have bided our time, healed our wounds, probed our own depths as individuals, and now it is time to shed our inaction, disarm our apathy, and begin consolidating our insights, energies, and resources into an aura of feeling, a dialogue of brothers and sisters. In other words, it is time to drop back in together." And one of the people who was involved with the Hodads said that one of his motivations, and I have to say, first of all, this was a jobs program for themselves. Their first motivation was to make money. But he said their other motivation was that they wanted to disprove the common stereotype of hippies as being lazy. that they wanted to show that you could still be countercultural in your thinking and be a productive member of society. And they go on with the $2 million that they, well, first of all, I should say that every Hodad owned a stake as a cooperative member, and they were funded that money with their labor. So I believe it was $1,000 was the cost of being a Hodad. And so at first you worked where a portion of your wage was held back each time that you earned money until that was done. And then you got actually more wages once your stake in the cooperative was paid in. And this helped to buy the various trucks and tools and all of that kind of thing that they needed to work and to help pay for transportation and all that kind of thing. But they wanted to show that they weren't lazy, and they wanted to show that they could contribute to society. So they took the profits of the organization and they underwrote a great deal that went on in Eugene. One of the reasons that Eugene is thought of as a center of the counterculture nationwide has to do with the Hodads and what they did and invested money. People read through the correspondence and they get all kinds of letters from other organizations here in Portland, some of them, and down in Eugene asking for help to support a lot of feminist organizations, actually, a rape information organization and daycare and an alternative school for kids and all of this. And they look at each of those things and they fund a lot of this. So a lot of the reason we think of this region really as the center of the counterculture, they helped underwrite that. And then they went on to the things I think people don't really acknowledge so much is that they were instrumental in getting regulations put out to regulate pesticides within the national forest. They had lots of problems themselves with the spraying of pesticides too soon before that they were entering the forest to do this planting, and it was making them sick. And so they sued on a couple of occasions to stop doing that to them. And it's been enshrined in legislation here in Oregon. So at any rate, so I just wanted to talk about how the counterculture both was not lazy and how important it has been to the environmental movement here in Oregon, and it's why we think of Oregon as a center of environmentalism because of the countercultural aspect of that. So at any rate, I want us to open up to conversation though with the whole group, because I think we have seen a lot of different ways that one can think about how environmental issues lay at the heart of a great deal of Oregon history and American history. So we can actually generate a conversation out of this. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I really appreciate the comments from all of you. I thought I knew a little something about Oregon, but now it looks as if it's just a blank slate that's just beginning to be filled in. First of all, how do you spell Hodad?
It's H-O-E-D-A-D.
It is a hoe.
Yes. It's a Hodad. It looks like, I don't have the images with me, but it looks like a hoe except for that the metal part of it is about yay tall and narrow. And it just kind of, you scoop and it makes just enough of a slit in the earth to stick a sprig in and then stomp it and move on.
Have you gone and reforested?
I have not.
Well, and the other comment
I probably should.
I have not really thought of history in terms of having the environmental impact that the four of you have brought up, and I really thank you for that. I've been running my head, I've been lecturing at Lincoln, and all of a sudden everything seems to be falling apart in a very positive way. But I can't say much more than that because I really haven't thought through the issues that you have, that you all have raised in different ways. And the life panel, in terms of four different aspects of it, and it all comes together delightfully confusing way. I particularly would like to make one comment, which is the fact that I guess you were talking about capital, that it's more a critique of capitalism and technology.
Oh, it was me that was saying
yeah,
that.
that's interesting to me because with technology, it's explaining every problem we have. Globalization, breakdown of community, but you can reverse it the other way. Well, it's also creating regionalism because people want to move out of it. So you have all of these different contradictory comments. When you get right down to it, capitalism does seem to be the issue that even pushes technology in the direction that it goes. That's something I just need to do a lot more thinking about. So for that,
I'd say real quickly that in environmental history, this has been a long debate. And one of the earlier environmental historians, a man named Donald Worcester, wrote a book called Dust Bowl, in which he argues that capitalism is at the root of the Dust Bowl and by implication at the root of most of our environmental problems, and the Hodads would have really agreed with that. But a lot of environmental historians have written of late that technology being related to that capitalistic problem, but a lot of historians of late, and I think maybe this goes to what you were saying, have argued that, well, on the one hand, while technology has sometimes been a problem, it's also been the liberator, I guess you could say, that has allowed us to get out into nature. Without the car and the good roads, most people who lived in cities would not have access to that, and so it's created an appreciation of nature, so it cuts both ways.
And you're Henry George, I assume Henry George societies are still alive. Through the 80s, I used to drop in, I'm an East Coast guy, Grand Central Station, around 4 blocks from Grand Central Station, the Henry George Society, and I used to go to their meetings every time I had a moment, and I was amazed at the passion of single taxes in the 1980s, as late as the 1980s. I have not been back to one since then, but is it still going?
Yeah, they're still there. It's the Henry George School of Social Science.
God, and the passion of the people. And from all walks of life, you get some the down and outers, and you get some look like corporate heads. It's an amazing conglomeration.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Mark this question. You quote Lincoln. You say Lincoln made a crucial distinction regarding nature. Nature consisted of the physical world external to man, and it consisted of man too. It seemed to me as if that was the way you were treating environmental history, as if everything were natural. And I had difficulty in a lot of your chapters figuring out the interaction between nature and culture, but they're between nature and nature, or between organic nature and human nature. And the first chapter lost me. So, could you define the terms of, are we talking about man as an entirely separate entity from nature, as partially natural? Where is the line between the cultural and the natural? Or does it fluctuate through different times or definitions or what have you?
I mean, I think you're asking a really good question, and I assume that I made you go off the rails in chapter 1 on witchcraft. That was that was okay. So I mean, for me, and I try to define this in the book, nature is the material world broadly defined. I would say that humanity is within nature, so they are part of it. Now, what I tried to do in the book was also showed the different ways that past people thought about nature and talked about nature. So the connection that you can make between Lincoln talking about humankind being within nature, I think one connection is to Larry, where he's talking about Locke. And it is the nature of humanity to exercise labor on nature and thereby create property and wealth and so forth. So I think that's one connection that one can make. So I apologize for not making that more clear and sorting that out. But also in my defense, I'd say the confusion is back there in the past with people thinking myriad things about what nature is. I mean, they thought all kinds of stuff. Now, if you wanted to carry it further, one of the distinctions that many contemporary thinkers make today is between people and the rest of the creation, if you want to put it that way, because people have consciousness. And there's a way in which consciousness, also called mind, can operate outside of material bounds, that it itself can imagine things that in turn then reshape the natural world, including the material of the human body. So I think if you wanted to make a distinction of some part of it that perhaps stands outside of the material that we call nature, which includes the organic human body, it's mind or consciousness. I would always say that it's relational, that even the abstract things that people think, the consciousness that they have, whatever fantastical things people think, it is grounded in an organic body. So to me, I think one of the problems with the modern world is that we've imagined people outside of it, when in fact we're always contained within it. I hope that helps. But I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, it seems like that actually is the thing that ties these things together, because from all of your descriptions, it feels like people come at nature with a preconceived notion of what they think it is. And in each one of these cases where people conflict, nature, the actual nature is the final judge of who's right. You can have your model about what things are supposed to be, but in the end, if you're wrong, things go badly, and nature always is there, being the final judge.
You know, the human nature divide has been pretty problematic through history. It's, I mean, the more you study that, the more you sort of want to throw up your arms, you know, and cry uncle. For instance, you know, national parks and many other places that have been where agencies have tried to preserve nature have had these sort of problems that they've had to deal with. Like, to what extent is the existing nature that we identify as being worthy of being preserved exist without the management of prior human beings who lived on that land? In other words, Native Americans. And that has opened up all kinds of different kinds of questions, right? I mean, are Native Americans part of nature? Do they lack consciousness and culture? So there's all kinds of problems, ultimately, in this effort. I agree with you. I mean, I think this is one of the things that environmental history has moved us to think about, is that the emphasis on separating human beings from this sort of cultural imagination that we can live outside of nature fundamentally doesn't work. And this is why environmental historians are moving in the direction that the market is chartered.
I think another piece of that is, you know, you begin with bodily labor. And then the other thing that environmental historians have begun to point out is that it's virtually impossible to separate the human body from the environments through which it moves, lives, breathes, etc. It's really hard to disentangle those things. Bodies are of the places in which they exist, and I think that's the opening for people to say, you know, you can reasonably draw boundaries. You can say beavers are a part of nature. Beavers act upon nature.
But doesn't that sort of end up, and I think you said something like this, everything influences everything else. Well, that's ecological science. Does that mean that we're going to start writing history from the standpoint of evolutionary biology?
I think actually you've got it reversed.
Okay.
Biology is the first historical science. Darwin does that. And in many respects, as we think about the past, we automatically, as historians, begin to think about something that somebody else might call co-evolution, because it's a relationship. It's not a singular, unidirectional relation. It's not only bidirectional, it's multi-directional. I think one of the things that right now is perhaps the most vexing for all of us to face is the potential that scientists, mostly information scientists, are now discussing, which is the brain outside the body. I think when that sort of science becomes a question mark, something that somebody might move toward, and this is well beyond designer people, which I think is coming. I don't think there's much that's going to stop that. And I'm talking about, of course, a long time, but still, I think it's there. Not having a firm, I would argue, a firm understanding of the coevolution of human beings and nature from the very beginning is going to beggar us when we get to that point, potentially. So I think what Mark is talking about is that historians bear a responsibility to stop this, what I would basically call a kind of a narrowing of the historical enterprise, and open it up to the full experience of human beings in the world that they live in. And that means all kinds of things that many of them are contradictory. And I think you identified a couple of, you did a quotation from Mark's book, but I think actually what you're unearthing is Mark's, I would call fairly courageous approach to the contradictions. What historians have done in the past is, some of us aren't very courageous. We would elude those, or we would avoid this kind of problem. And we really have to face them if we're going to be of benefit. I have many colleagues who, over the years, for very good reasons, from when I started teaching in the 70s on, saw history as a form of social work. And this turned out not to work very well, not unsurprisingly. What really is needed is not a form of social work, it's a form of understanding our social position as human beings in this broader world. And it's going to take historians to do that, not to denigrate anthropologists or sociologists or any of the other disciplines. But history really does have this as a primary burden. We are expected to not only make sense out of the past, but to draw meaning from it. And if we shorten that meaning to only a portion of human activity, then we've got a problem. And I think Mark's heading in the right direction, and a lot of other environmental historians that you ticked off are doing the same thing.
I'd like to do a little disputation here. And if anything, the first Earth Day was really, in many ways, an anti-countercultural movement. And there was zero population growth and litter. You go back to the Capitol strike that began in 1968 with Nixon administration and the withdrawing of the log-rests of previous years. I think you're getting pretty much tighter. And by 1970, what you're having is actually a shift, not to how can we live off the land, but how do we make a living off the land. And the other problem, basically, with the Hodite, that is they were not able to spark a greater movement of cooperative work associations with it. But initially, the Earth Day, the environmental movement, is not a radical movement, and in many ways was set up as a way of channeling radicalism, or the challenge of radicalism in the 60s into traditional channels. And it breaks out after that.
I'd say that's true, but I don't think that was successful in that I believe that there were countercultural groups that, like, well, the Hodettes didn't exist yet, but counterculturalists who saw in their minds wanting to challenge and basically drop out of society on the one hand, and yet in the process of forging a different relationship with society, moved in this direction of various kinds of environmental movements. And you see this even among the communes. When I started working on this book of essays on counterculturalists and started trying to think of what kind of organizations would I turn to, I expected to turn to the communes as one of the chief ones, and I found that although the communes have been very active oftentimes in developing organic farming and all of this kind of thing, very few of them had that as their reason for forming. They had other ideas about this. But the Hodads and other groups, like Terra Squirma, it started off as something else, but it developed an environmental portion to it. But they really were wanting to create a totally alternative society. I agree that the Earth Day wasn't that, but it's really spurred in a sense by the protests of Earth Day to begin with. It's just kind of a trigger for them, I think.
I was just thinking, I was very intrigued by comparing, Bill, your presentation with your presentation, Larry, comparing them back to back. It underlined an interesting contrast or comparison between where value lies. It seemed like that was crucial to both of what you said. In one instance, you had value which resided in space and land, which is fixed. In another case, you have value which resides in labor, which is not fixed. It's transportable. And that seems to kind of get to one of the crucial differences in the two cultures which came into conflict in the American West in Oregon at that time. I found that very interesting. I don't have a question there.
Yeah, great. May I follow up on that? Yeah, I mean, I thought that was really interesting too. I agree with you on that. But so the idea that Whitman separates the spirituality of the land from the land of the potatoes. And I was wondering when you were talking about the potatoes, you were referring to energy, and that they were tapping into these energies, new power, new energy. And it seemed like you were talking both about religion and the potatoes. So did they see any transcendence? Did the Cayuse and the other native people see any transcendent significance in the potato? Did they say, wow, this is some kind of new plant that has tremendous, not only food value, but also something else? Did they see it that way? Did they see the spirituality and the food locked in together?
I don't see any evidence that they would make a distinction about the potato or anything else from nature as having more or less spiritual value.
Okay.
But they certainly understood the relevance of energy in nature as, one might say, tappable or acquirable by humans. By the 1850s, almost every native group in the lower Columbia River grew potatoes with quite a bit of not only cultivation but tending. In other words, to increase the potato crop. And so to the extent to which agriculture in some ways succeeds in some larger term, it's through the native population's easier adoption, much more so than, say, wheat, much more so than something that would be a little less understandable from their own tradition of gathering. So to that extent, yes. But the original agreement expected benefits that were economic in combination with benefits that were spiritual. So they were both confused by the fact that the Whitmans had nothing to sell. And H.W. Perkins, who's at Wascotown, at the Dalles, his journal is full of this. Would they stop coming and asking for knives? I don't have any knives. All I have is, my preaching. So back to this main point that was raised, which is that for Native people, this energy in nature and their spiritual, one might say, foundation and hope were intertwined. They literally could not be pulled apart without the destruction of both.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. What a great one. Even better than I hoped it would be. We have some copies of the Republic of Nature at the museum store. Many of you are members. You get your member discount here. And Mark is probably willing to sign copies. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This was great. Thank you all.
Larry's book is there too.
And Larry's book is there too.